Good evening. Welcome back to another episode of Studio 118. That's a way to start off. It's going to be a great night already.
It's going to be a wonderful night.
Well, I'm Reuben. This is Bunjee.
Eddie.
This is Studio 118, brought to you by Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. Come, let us reason. And that's going to have special significance this evening as we are talking about the rules of reality. There's no background theme music to that. I'm sorry. That's okay. Hey. It's going to be a very special episode. It's going to be a good one.
So special.
Yes, so special.
So episodic.
Ooh, epic and episodic. Hey, before we get to our very special, significant, episodic episode, we want to get some announcements out of the way. We're broadcasting live from Calvary South Austin here in Austin, Texas. We're broadcasting on YouTube. So if you're on our live chat, why don't you say hi? And while you're there, why don't you hit the like button, subscribe, and also why don't you share the live stream link on your social media platform, spread the word, because as you know, as we always mention, we have a Q&A part after our discussion. We'd love to hear from you, get your questions in. As today, we're talking about the rules of reality, aka laws of logic. So get your questions in, and we'll queue them up. Also, if you're watching us on Austin Cable Access Channel 11, we welcome you. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, you can call our church at 512-576-5433. We'd love to hear from you as well. Here at Calvary South Austin, we'd love to invite you to worship with us and have a Bible study with us. We meet on Sunday mornings at 9:15 a.m. and 11:15 a.m., as well as Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. So we invite you to come join us and be part of the fellowship. But aside from that, Bunjee, we're going to get into this episode right away.
Let's get into it.
The Rules of Reality.
I love it.
Last month, we kind of hinted at some of this stuff. What did we talk about last?
Seems like it was just like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it seems so very close to today.
Yeah, we had a back to school special.
That's right. It was a back to school special. We
covered a lot of ground.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if that's something you're interested in, of course, we talk about a lot of topics here on this show, Studio 118. But visit our YouTube page. And you can see all the backlog of episodes that we've done so far. But last month was a back-to-school special, and it was pretty much, as I said, a smorgasbord.
It was great.
It was a bunch of topics. And
it was a fun time.
Yeah, so now kind of a little bit of an extension of that is we want to talk about, there's a lot of reasoning that needs to be done through those questions, through those topics. And what else do you need but to know about the rules of reality? What governs reality? How do we make our way through it? How do we think through it? And it's also been called the laws of logic. So if that's something new to you, don't worry. We'll get to explaining it here in a bit. It's nothing too academic, nothing too crazy. In fact, wasn't too long ago that these laws of logic, these rules of reality were being taught in our school systems, right?
Sure, yeah.
But sadly, no more. I did not get to partake in that, so it took me a while to catch up.
Right, yeah. I think it's a shame, and of course, they teach mathematics, they teach algebra, and all this is rooted in the laws of logic. You have to have the laws of logic in order to engage in language. Math, any sort of reasonable thinking. The laws of logic are necessary for determining whether we're thinking rationally or not. The laws of logic are necessary for making sure that our thoughts actually correspond with reality.
Yes.
There's reality. There's the reality of our existence. Then we have thoughts about all of that.
Yeah.
Do those thoughts actually correspond to reality?
Yeah.
And the laws of logic are necessary, so that we can examine our thoughts and put them to the test and arrive at a conclusion that, yes, these thoughts do correspond to reality, or no, they don't. And if they don't, then they're not true thoughts. And if the thoughts actually do correspond to reality, then those are true thoughts.
Sounds very meta.
Yeah. It is. Because we're actually, starting to deal with what's been called the preconditions of intelligibility.
Yeah. So to even know about anything, there's certain assumptions that have to be understood or made, and then you can just work your way from there, and then you can start having rational thoughts about the world.
Sure.
But we want to understand essentially what's at the very bottom, what governs these rules of reality, as it were.
Or if you flip it around, what's at the very top of all this, right? Like, what's at the highest level of our thinking?
Yeah, the most meta of metas. Yeah.
Yes. What has to be in place for the thoughts in your brain then communicated through language to properly convey those concepts through my ears into my brain, so that I walk away understanding what it is that you are communicating to me, and then walk away with truthful thoughts about all of that? Like, what has to be in place for all of that to take place?
Well, I can't do anything about your brain.
Nope.
But I can do some stuff about the words coming out of my mouth, at least.
Yes.
I gave him the best shot I could, but it went in the ear, and I don't know what happened in there.
Yep.
No, you're right. And what's interesting is, like I said, I came late to this game, man. First of all, I became a Christian when I was 20, and it wasn't until I became a Christian, when I was challenged about my views. We talked about this last month, or 2 weeks ago now.
Both statements are true.
Where I was challenged then about my faith and what grounded my faith, and that actually got me onto the road of, okay, how do I even think clearly about these kinds of topics? And that got me into, there's laws of logic. And so I mention all this to say that a good number, probably the vast majority of people out there, we don't even think about laws. Am I using laws of logic? Am I using them correctly? We're just trying to make sense of the world. All the while, unknowingly, we're using the laws of logic either correctly or incorrectly.
Yes.
And that's what we're here to do today, is kind of summarize, that's what I've been talking about. This is what I've been using. I've been using appeals to whatever. We might have been using a bunch of fallacious reasoning.
Sure. Yeah.
But we're trying to clear that up as well, and saying, how can we as Christians, or just a person in general, think clearly about big topics? And then what all does it lead to? Is it going to lead to a certain worldview being true or false? And can it actually help us narrow down which worldview is the ultimate true worldview? These are big questions that you never would have known. Man, these little old laws of logic. Yeah. There's only 3 of them, as we'll see. They do such a big service to us.
Yeah, and then we can bring in like a fourth one, which is both and. Which when you said right. Our show last month, that was 2 weeks ago, and that's one of those cases where it's both and, right? Which is a trinary form of logic, but in order to properly use a trinary form of logic, it has to be based in the binary laws of logic that we'll get in and identify here in a moment. But there's also this concept, that I have where I do believe that there is innate information, like we're not born a blank slate, that when God creates us in the womb, that He is placing within our soul certain bits of information that is kind of like preloaded, software. So that includes His law, so that we know right from wrong, the moral law. This also includes physical laws that we understand, at a very young age, though we have yet to define those, until maybe, excuse me, closer to like, 8th grade or something.
Yeah.
But then there are the laws of logic that I believe that God has placed within us. Like that's innate information I believe we're born with. But then those laws are extended beyond the innate information in an abstract, immaterial way, which then I believe is based in these preconditions of intelligibility that God has put into motion, so that reality corresponds, or so that I'm thinking or able to determine, a thought process with the laws that are part of my design by God's design.
Yeah.
But then those innate laws that little kids recognize.
Yes.
Are working together with the design and the order of the universe which includes these, like I said, these immaterial entities, these abstract entities that we call the laws of logic. Yeah. So there's layers to all this, and that's why from the ground up, from the planet Earth up into I guess the immaterial realm of where God has stored maybe this information in some sort of way that we don't quite understand. It's pretty interesting to think through how this all works together, and then we'll see that this all kind of leads us to the evidence for a creator God.
Yeah, and you mentioned how even kids grasp it, right? Like, and I have 3 kids of my own and you can see even as they're infants, it's one of those things where, the rules of reality, either you can discover them, academically or just by, in a learned setting, or it kind of, life comes at you,
Life does come at you.
So it's one of those things where, I was trying to walk into this wall. It can't be both and at that point.
That's right.
So
That's
it's either me or the wall. Rules of reality, they will come hit you in the face real quick.
And just at the next birthday party, put one large piece of cake in front of one child and a small piece of cake in front of the other child, and you'll see the laws of logic kick in real quick. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
I identify that piece as larger than mine.
No, Timmy, they're both the same. Yeah, we're trying to play games with the laws of logic these days, in many other ways, and we might get into that a little bit later. But so you mentioned the grounds of intelligibility. So it is true that these laws of logic that we're going to get to, but underneath that or on top, however you want to think about it, meta or otherwise, there has to be these truths that are assumed, that are presumed, that just help us make sense of the world that we're in general, right? So why don't we get into these first principles, as it were?
Sure.
There's 12 of them, as we know them, but they also help us. And as we're mentioning them, you, the audience, you'll probably notice that these are such simple and even almost simplistic, obvious truths.
Tautological?
Yeah, tautological almost. It's like, really, duh, we know that. But taken together, they present a strong case for, this actually, now I can see why this helps us reason the way we do and why things make sense in the world. So let's get into it. The first principles of reality. And we just want to mention that without these basic first principles of reality, nothing can be known. Everything we know about reality, we are known by these first principles.
Right. And then also to argue against them would be to prove them.
Yes, that's going to come up a lot.
So they're undeniable. So let's get into it.
Yeah, the first principle here is that being is. That's a complete sentence.
Right.
And that's it. Being is.
Which is not to be confused with the Bee Movie.
Right. Not the Jerry Seinfeld flop.
Yeah.
What's the deal with bees?
Yeah, I watched it, and it stung me in the end.
Yeah.
But being is different from Bee Movie. So being is, which is the principle of existence.
Yes. That essentially existence is. I mean, this is noticeable in the fact that in my own mind, I'm thinking, as Rene Descartes famously said, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, you don't want to put Descartes before Deshorse.
Yeah, we don't. But it's true that at the very bottom of it, no matter what you think about the world, whether you're a solipsist or something, being is.
That's right. And the person who says, I don't be, who said that? So that's where I say it's undeniable.
Yeah.
Because the minute you deny it, you prove it.
Exactly.
If I say I don't exist, I must exist to be able to deny it, right? So it's just completely undeniable.
Somewhere out there's somebody saying, not true,
False.
I don't exist. I can prove it.
Yep.
So yes, existence is the first principle, which leads now to the second principle, which is, funnily enough, being is being.
That's right.
We're just going to tag on words here. Being is being. This is the principle of identity, and this is going to become more important later. But this essentially says you have existence, but now you can start to identifying other things. A thing, the principle of identity says that a thing is identical to itself. I mean, this is, again, tautological.
Right.
If I say that this is a water bottle, that's because it has the principles or the attributes of a water bottle. It is what it is.
Right.
And it can't be anything else, right?
That's right.
So if it weren't a water bottle, then I couldn't say it was a water bottle. So this is basic stuff. We identify things all over the place. So being is being. Now we get to the third principle, which is a twist on the second one, which is now is being is not non-being.
That's right.
Help us make sense of this.
Well, so you can't be the being that you're referring to and not be that same being at the same time. Okay. So this gets into contradictions, yes. and a lot of people are quick to recognize when contradictory statements are made, and they're yes. quick to insist that that's fallacious. So, but when we're talking about the preconditions of intelligibility, and we're talking about these first principles of logical thinking, these are simple truths. They're tautologies, and yet they have to be stated. Yeah. So that we stay on course with what is logical and what's not, right?
Exactly.
So being is not non-being. It's undeniable, very simple, and yet it's a necessary first principle of right. rational thought.
Yeah, and hopefully you, the audience member, can start seeing the pattern here, how these are now just extensions of the previous principles, right? So we had being is being, which is identity. But the implication of that is that, well, being is not non-being.
Yep.
Right.
So which sets up the basis for the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's another extension of that, which is going to become another law of logic, which either being or non-being. So we're talking in vague generalities here, right? Being and non-being. But here, this is the principle of excluded middle, which says you either have being or non-being. There is no middle ground. You can't really say sort of.
Right.
It either is being or non-being.
Which later on we can get into what is a false dichotomy. Yeah. Which is when somebody does say it's either this or it's that, when there might be a third option.
Yeah. Is it a true dichotomy?
But at the very root of it, there is a basis in being where you're either a being or you're not. There's no other option.
Yeah.
If you're a being, then you're a being, and if it's not a being, then it's not a being. There's no third option here.
Exactly. It's been put this way: since opposites cannot both be true, nothing can hide in the cracks. There's only two choices, especially when you have it. The way I like to think about it is, those Venn diagrams, right? You have those circles that kind of overlap whenever there's commonalities.
Right.
With opposites, they're exclusive. They stay in their own lane. They never overlap. So you either have this circle or that circle, and there's nothing else. There's no other choices, right?
Yep.
Now let's get to our fifth principle out of 12. We have now non-being cannot cause being.
This starts getting us into biogenesis.
Yep.
Right? This starts bringing us closer to questions of origins and creation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Non-being cannot cause being.
Yeah. So, this is also known as the principle of causality. Mm-hmm. And again, these are things that in our general experience, we kind of take them for granted. We know that there's nothing on this, in this vacuous space, nothing exists in there. We can wait for eternity, and nothing will ever come out of that non-beingness.
Unless a being comes along and places another being exactly. there, right?
There has to be some sort of external force, but it has to come from something,
right?
Not nothing, right? So nothing, as it's probably understood, no thing does not exist. There's no properties to it. So only what exists can cause existence. This is the principle of causality.
I oftentimes ask people to, imagine nothing for a moment. And then as I see them trying to process that, I ask them, did you think of all black? Right? Because that's still something.
Yes. That has a property of being black.
That's right.
That's true. How do you even think about
it? You can't even think about nothing.
Yeah. Well, if you ask Lawrence Krauss, which is a famed astrophysicist, I think out of Arizona State, he will tell you that nothing is actually something,
Well, yeah.
and it can actually create things.
These are the games that people play when they start saying, well, a negative amount of these things and a positive amount of these things equals nothing. And it's just like, well, now you're just playing with mathematics. You know, it's like that's not a real nothingness. That is a bunch of negative things in equal amounts to the positive things, and therefore mathematically they cancel each other out. But that's still not nothing.
Right. Yeah. He's committing the fallacy of equivocation, as we'll learn a little later. But yes, we understand this, that nothing or non-being cannot cause anything.
Well, because, I mean, he's trying to say that zero is nothing.
Yes.
And zero is not nothing.
And even the models that they show, there are still physical properties that exist. And it's not nothing. It's something. He just wants to call it nothing.
Yes.
Like, as you said, it just, whatever properties they add up to zero. And he says that's nothing.
Right.
Come on, Krause.
Silly.
You do better than that. But this leads us into now the sixth principle, halfway done here. And we see that contingent being, that's a fancy word, we'll get into that. Contingent being cannot cause contingent being. This is known as, you guessed it, the principle of contingency.
I was going to guess that.
Yeah. Principle of contingency. So contingency is really just the property of being not necessary or being contingent. You're not necessary, meaning there's a possibility that you couldn't have existed, right? You came about. You came to be at some point in time. Therefore, you didn't always exist. So you are contingent. There was a time where you began to exist. But this principle is basically stating that if you are a being that is contingent, if at some point you came to be, then you cannot account for your own existence, right? The cause of your your cause of being, it cannot be found within yourself.
Yes.
Because there was a time where I didn't exist.
Right.
So something else had to cause my existence, and it wasn't a contingent being.
My existence is contingent upon the existence of someone else.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my very existence and my ongoing existence has to be accounted for something other than another contingent being. Okay. So if you're staying with us, let's proceed slowly now to the next principle, which is only necessary beings. Okay, here's another fancy word. Only necessary beings can cause a contingent being. And I think this is what we were getting at. This is known as the positive principle of modality. Very nice. But here, necessary being, which is really just kind of the flip side of contingent being. A contingent being, as we said, is a being that could have not been or came to be. So then a necessary being is a being that has always been.
Right.
Right. And because it's necessary, it owes its existence. It can be found in itself. The cause of its existence can be found in itself.
And I would take issue with that terminology too, because a necessary being would be an infinite being, and therefore needs no cause.
Yes, I would say the explanation of its existence can be found in and of itself.
Right.
So it has no cause. Because by definition, a contingent being has a cause, but a necessary being does not have a cause.
That's right.
And based on an extension of the previous principles, we're saying here with this one is that only a necessary being can give rise or give existence to a contingent being.
And we might sum it up like this, that we can't traverse the infinite regression of contingent beings going all the way back to eternity past. Because we would never arrive at the beginning of any of that. Therefore, we would have never arrived at today.
Yeah.
So we can't try to trace an infinite number of contingent beings giving way to the next all the way to eternity past. We have to end up at a necessary being who initially starts all other contingent beings from his own existence.
Now, maybe we can pause here and just a little bit of a sneak peek, right? And so you as the audience member, I want to get those gears rolling in your head. Start thinking about what other worldviews does this sound like? For instance, I'm thinking naturalism, and even extension atheism, which not too long ago, just a generation ago, the popular view was that the universe itself was necessary.
Right.
Right. So there should have been no explanation, no cause for the universe coming to being, but that was blown out of the water.
Blown out of the water.
There's also another worldview. I think it's either Hinduism or both Hinduism and Buddhism, which believe that the universe is necessary. It's always been. It's just an extension of reality, the ultimate reality, Brahman or whatever. And so start thinking about what worldviews espouse these kinds of denials of these principles here.
Right.
And that'll get the gears rolling for as we get into the laws of logic in just a little bit. So we see that only necessary being can kind of be the ultimate cause of a contingent being. And by implication then, our next principle says that, well, a necessary being, by definition, cannot cause another necessary being.
Right.
Because as we said, by definition, a necessary being is a being which has no cause. So you cannot create another infinite or necessary being, right?
I mean, it's such a negative principle of modality.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, so, and by the very definition of a necessary being, if that necessary being was caused by another being, then it's no longer a necessary being.
Yep.
And this kind of gets into the belief in many gods who were caused by a god before them. It's like, well, hold on a second. And what kind of God is that?
Yeah.
What kind of God is that was created by another god prior to them, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, necessary beings don't cause necessary beings because necessary beings need no cause.
Yeah. I think we like to call those gods lowercase g gods.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. So we can even just think about this, that an infinite being cannot go and create another infinite being that's
Right.
just equally as necessary or infinite, right?
An infinite being can create eternal beings,
But they have a starting point.
but they have a beginning,
Yeah.
and then can exist eternally.
Yeah.
But that's different from an infinite being, because when we talk about an infinite being, we're not talking about a really old being, so to speak, because an infinite being is a being that sits outside of time. And so it would be more like a timeless being that has no beginning and no end.
Yeah.
Whereas an eternal being is a being with a start and then no end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what the Marvel movie, The Eternals, is about?
Maybe.
Does it explain that?
I'm not
Great
sure.
detail.
I've given up on MCU now that Disney has completely destroyed them.
I've heard they now call it the MCU. I don't know why.
Wow.
I think something based on the new She-Hulk lawyer show. I don't know what's going on there.
I just can't.
I haven't given up. I just
can't.
I haven't caught up. If you guys have any comments about Marvel Universe, let us know in the chat thread. We have a very astute Marvel fan there in the booth that can answer all your questions about Marvel. Continuing on our first principles, we only got 3 more here. So we just talked about how a necessary being cannot give rise or cause another necessary being. And our next principle now says that every contingent being is caused by a necessary being. Or another way to put it is that all contingent beings need a cause, and since a contingent being has the possibility to not exist, then it does not account for its own existence in itself. This is, I think, what you were just saying, how at some point you have to reach a stopping point,
Right.
and saying there's got to be a need for a necessary being.
Yeah,
necessary being is necessary.
This is that first principle of existential causality. You have to end up at an uncaused cause.
Yeah.
You have to. And every contingent being that has a beginning, at some point, in some way, has to be traced back to the uncaused cause.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, as we talked about even in our last episode, how these are not new arguments that we're bringing up.
Oh,
either.
no.
These are things that have been thought about and debated for centuries, even more than millennia. So we're really just rehashing these arguments in modern parlance. But
That's right.
Let's continue on here. 2 more. Our next principle says that necessary being exists. Okay, so now we've gotten all these kind of preconditions, as you call them, right, that are setting up this condition now that says, well, based on these definitions and what reality must look like, we know then, by definition, a necessary being must exist.
Right.
Right? As you said, there has to be a stopping point, and based on that definition, well, then a necessary being exists.
It only follows that if being is being, and contingent beings demand a necessary being, and if it's true that contingent beings actually exist, then a necessary being must also exist.
Yep.
Pretty simple.
Pretty simple, as we've been mentioning. And our last principle, or rather, we have two more, sorry. The next one says that contingent being exists, which, I mean, that's not as fancy as necessary being existing, but it's true. Are you a contingent being?
I believe I am.
Yeah?
Yeah. It all depends.
I'm trying to work my way up to necessary. I've been told I'm expendable. I'm not necessary yet. All right. Our last principle here is that necessary being is similar to contingent beings it causes. This is known as the principle of analogy. And really what we want to state here is that we can gather a sense of what the qualities of this necessary being are based on what we see the qualities of the contingent beings.
Right.
So
we might say it like this, that the contingent being won't be greater than the necessary being, but that there's good reason to think that we're going to find information about our Creator in the way He's created us.
Yes. Analogous, meaning we can see how it's the same, we're the same as our cause in one sense, but we can also see the differences in another sense.
Sure.
Here we have that we're the same as our cause in the same sense of being, we exist, but we're different in the sense of potentiality, meaning we're not pure actuality. We have limits, we're finite beings, and so we can see that, well, if our cause is necessary, then that must be actual infinite potentiality, or what we call actuality.
Right.
So we're different in that sense.
As a necessary being, the necessary being, the uncaused cause, would be infinite, and therefore infinite in every attribute, where we have potential. We have potential to change, to learn, to grow, to die. There's potential that we have because we're not infinite, and yet still there's enough of a thumbprint, if you will, of our Creator in the way that He's designed us, that we can arrive at some conclusions about what the necessary being would probably be like just by looking at humankind.
Yeah, very good. And so these 12 first principles that we just walked our way through, again, these are first principles of knowledge, of reality. Understanding and just being familiar with these first principles now help us to view reality for what it is. But then tucked away within these first principles, grow our laws of logic that we use on a daily basis now to reason about reality. How do we reason about the things that we're learning, that we're picking up, and how do we think through them thoughtfully but also correctly using these laws of logic? So do you have anything more to add on the first principles before we get into the laws of logic?
Well, yeah, as we move into the laws of logic, I would point to these first principles and say that these things must be true for the laws of logic to then function in the way that they should. Right? So in order for us to have laws of logic, these first principles of rationality, these preconditions for intelligibility must exist. Otherwise, there's no real basis for rational thinking.
Yeah. And, I was just thinking also how, again, I want to help and challenge the audience member out there to start thinking through, okay, if these are the preconditions for intelligibility, start thinking through what other worldviews offer as far as how do they line up with these preconditions. Are they denying some of them? Are they denying most of them, if not all of them? How do they work around these preconditions that govern reality? Because as we said, we worked our way from just being is, just the understanding that there has to be existence. Because as long as there's one of me thinking and talking, even if it's in my own head, there's existence.
Right.
And I know that I've never have always existed. Does that make sense? There was a time where I came to be. My brain's going like this right now. Talking about being and not being.
I love beans.
Yeah. So I know that I have not always existed. That's what you're looking for. Therefore, there's a necessary being. We worked our way all through that. There's a necessary being that needs to be in place, and that necessary being exists.
Because as incredible as your parents are, they are also not necessary beings. And their parents, and their parents, and all the way back, right? And we can continue to follow our lineage, and all we'll find is a long line of contingent beings who must eventually find their existence in the necessary, uncaused creator.
Yeah. Yeah,
but then also considering the other religious systems, if their first principles of rational thinking are different, how would that affect the laws of logic? What kind of laws of logic would those worldviews produce?
Right.
Because they probably wouldn't end up with these three.
Yeah, that's true. So, yeah, why don't we jump into what these three laws of logic are?
Yep.
And I can tell you, I remember the moment when I came across these, and it's like a light bulb went off, and it's just like...
you already knew it was true.
Yeah.
Now you've identified it.
And now you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
It was almost like the movie Phenomenon. Just seeing. I don't know.
How's it go again? Were you an extra in that movie?
I'm just remembering. What's his name? John Travolta just looking, pointing. I don't remember. He's a good actor. But here's laws of logic. These are the methods in place that just help us to reason and reason well. And as we've been saying all along, to deny these is to actually affirm them.
Right.
So don't try this at home. All right, let's get into the first one. The first law of logic is known as the law of identity.
What's that? Can you identify that for me?
Identify that? Yeah. It's the law of identity. That's what it is. And this just boils down to A is A.
Yeah.
Or a water bottle is a water bottle.
And in the first principle, it was being is being, right?
Yes,
so being is being, and there's our law of identity.
Yeah. And the way I like to think about it is that, when I see A equals A, I like to think of that equal sign basically saying that whatever is on both sides of this equal sign, it's the same thing.
Right.
It's the same as. And so if there is something on one side of the equal sign that is different, then it violates the law of identity.
Right.
It is not the same thing. So for a thing to be what it is, it has to have certain attributes. And if I want to say another certain thing is the same kind of thing, it has to have all the same attributes.
Right.
And nothing different about it. Otherwise, it violates the law of identity.
And furthermore, not even just with the language, but my thoughts about this thing. I have to make sure that my thoughts about this bottle of water, correspond to reality, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So it, the language is just my communication of my thoughts, and so getting past the language of it all. Mm-hmm. My thoughts actually have to correspond to reality, so that when I think about the wetness of water, or the rigidity of the plastic bottle, or when I consider these concepts, that those thoughts actually have to line up or correspond to reality, so that I am communicating rational thoughts that are actually real.
Yes. So there's two fronts that we have to think about. One is what the thing actually is, and then on the second front is how am I thinking and reasoning in my own mind about the actual thing. Those two things have to correspond
in order to properly communicate.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about when I say, and then you also have to just use the same laws of logic when I say, hey, can you grab me a cup of water?
Yeah.
When that language comes out, when those words come out and I'm communicating, you're taking that in, and guess what you're probably going to do, if you don't mind? You're going to go grab a cup and put some water in it and bring me a cup of water, right? Mm-hmm. Because that just worked out that way, and you know, you used your laws of logic, I used my laws of logic, and bada boom, bada bing. Look at that. We all identified the same things.
Yeah,
it's amazing how it works.
Yeah, and
almost by design.
Yeah, almost by design, right? And that, again, for our audience, to help you out here, start thinking through why does it work out that way?
Right. If I say, "Can you grab me a cup of water?" Why is it that you don't grab a cat and bring me a cat? Right.
Yeah.
Or, you know,
unless your cat's name is Water, cup of water. I mean,
that's a good point.
I'm just spitballing here. All right, so yeah, we take these things for granted, but such a simple law of logic, identifying anything, is something that we don't even think twice about.
Right.
We just are pointing at things, identifying them as well. These days, we're getting a little mixed up in identifying things.
Well, most certainly, there is clearly a breakdown in the law of identification after years and years of not teaching our kids about the laws of logic.
There you go. Yeah. Very well put.
Now they're having a hard time identifying the difference between men and women.
Yep.
Very simple things.
Yeah.
Yep.
So law of identity, simple, A equals A, and it cannot be anything else. And that leads us into our second law of logic that helps us reason well, which is known as the law of non-contradiction. So this says that A cannot be equal to not A.
Right.
A and not A cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense.
Right.
Okay. So if my favorite example is this: if I pull out a wallet and I say I show you that I have a $5 bill in there, and I say I have $5, and then I close it and say I don't have $5 in my wallet.
Were you in Detroit?
Yeah, probably. It happened
because it probably got stolen
that quickly. But it's one of those Velcro wallets. It was very difficult to get in there. I would have heard it. But no, I cannot. Those two statements: I have $5 in my wallet and I don't have $5 in my wallet. They both cannot be true.
Right.
At the same time and in the same sense. Now, if the second time that I said I don't have $5 in my wallet and I meant something different by $5, then I'm not really committing the law of non-contradiction, because it didn't mean it in the same sense.
Right.
So that's my workaround there. But so you have to take this definition as a whole, in the same time and in the same sense. Two opposites cannot be true.
Yep.
And again, we just are very well attuned with this law of logic in our very everyday experience. That's that wallet example. When we see something fishy going on, said, I just saw something, and you're trying to convince me that the opposite is true. I'm not buying it, right?
Right.
So I think we call it when politicians speak, right? So we know when things are violating the law of non-contradiction very easily.
Yes.
All right. And now our third law of logic, and there's only three of them. These are very easy to remember. We have law of identity, and second was law of non-contradiction. Our last one here is law of excluded middle. Want to take a stab at that? Law of excluded middle.
You know, so this really gets into the dichotomy between, you know, if it's A, then it's not non-A, and if it's non-A, then it's not A. You know, these are two exclusive concepts, right? So when something is identified as this, then it's not going to be identified as something that's not that.
Yeah. So, and I guess the way of always that helped me remember it and understand it was is that to be a true opposite, right? It has to be not A.
Right.
And that's where we're going to get to like these false dichotomies. So you have to have A and not A, and then there's just no middle ground. You have excluded the middle from that.
Yep.
And so,
well put.
A little bit of a sneak peek, right? So a statement like either God exists or he does not exist. Those are your only two options.
That's right.
There's no middle ground. Well, he sort of exists, and kind of. We don't use that kind of language. We either say he either exists or doesn't exist.
Yep.
In families, when the wife comes to the husband and says, "I'm pregnant," or it shows the pregnancy test, right? You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant.
Yeah.
There is no, I'm sort of pregnant. It doesn't happen that way, and I'm pretty sure that would just cause a lot of confusion and arguments. But
what about COVID?
Again,
I know people
These
that
days-
went for a test
Yes.
and then didn't take the test, but then they got the results of a test and it was positive.
Man.
I don't understand how that works, but maybe that's another show.
Maybe we're in a different reality. We're different rules of reality.
That's right.
Yeah. But yes, again, we just intuitively know when certain, it's either this or that, and there's nothing else that it can be.
No
right?
middle ground.
So just to summarize, the laws of logic that really govern our everyday reasoning and our communication with other people, and just the most simplest of tasks, is the law of identity, A is A, the law of non-contradiction, A and not A cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense, and then lastly, the law of excluded middle. It's either A or not A. Those are your only options. And that really is it.
That's it.
Laws of logic. And again, I remember when I first learned these, and then all of a sudden, man, my ears are like going like this. I'm starting to hear all sorts of contradictions, and even with my own reasoning. And I think this is why it was so helpful for me, is having not grown up with these understanding of the laws of logic. It really helped me fine tune and really buckle up my own reasoning. Right, so now I'm thinking about, okay, how do I operate in my place of employment and be a better reasoner, when I'm thinking through certain problems, but also theologically as a Christian now, as I'm getting to know more about God and reading through scriptures, it's helping me buckle up on, am I thinking through this clearly, or am I holding on to certain beliefs that violate the law of non-contradiction, right? And so this is where now it starts becoming, it opens up just a whole world of possibilities, but it also helps you kind of scrape away the bad reasoning that we've kind of carried on through years of not knowing the laws of logic. So this is why I was really excited about getting to know the laws of logic.
Yeah, of course. And, it's sad that there are so many who are living a contradictory life. They're a walking contradiction. They're living a life, according to many irrational beliefs and decisions, and they're struggling with it, but they don't know what to do with that. And so it's so important, even for parents who are watching, to help kids, help your kids to discover the laws of logic, to help them to define it and understand it. Because one of my conspiracy theories is that the public school education system has removed the teaching of the laws of logic, because if you actually teach kids the laws of logic, then they begin to think critically. Mm-hmm. And you can't have kids thinking critically if the plan is to raise them to just be submissive. Mm-hmm. Right? So if the concept there is, we just want kids to believe what they're told, not actually to think for this, critically about things and rationally, then it's a perfect plan. If the end game is to get people to just do what they're told without thinking critically about what they're being told, makes perfect sense. Yeah, get rid of the course on logic. Let that be for maybe philosophy majors once they get to the college level. Yeah. But how many will end up there? Yeah. And have their student loan paid for?
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. I have a book at home. It's a college level logic textbook that was written by a former what do you call him? The former. It's not the principal, but who used to be the dean of Princeton University, president. There you go, president of Princeton University. Mm-hmm. And this is as early as early 19th century. And he wrote a logic textbook for the university level that was mandatory at that time.
That's right.
And now slowly, as you said, it's just kind of being pushed off to the more just pure liberal arts majors and not required courses for everyone to take. So it's a very interesting move that has been made just over the past few generations to remove that as a mandatory course for all students, and even starting at the younger ages, of course. But now I firmly believe, we're starting to see the fruits of that. And it's bad fruit. We're seeing bad reasoning. And I put myself in that bucket, just growing up the whole time, just spewing out contradictions left and right, and also the way you live versus what you say you believe, kind of stuff. and we claim that, well, we just hold these things in tension. No, I mean, you're just thinking wrong about these things, right?
I remember when when that kind of snapped for me is before I became a Christian, but I was considering, the arguments for the Christian faith. I remember just I was upset, that I was listening to a lot of music that I disagreed with in the way I lived my life. And I couldn't reckon. That was one of the things that I had a hard time reconciling, was that I'm entertained by all these songs that glorify all kinds of stuff, and yet it was a lot of stuff. I listened to a lot of what would be considered devil music or demonic music that glorified all kinds of evil things that I would never go out and do myself, and yet this is what I'm entertaining myself with. And I started thinking about that, like why do I listen to this music that actually glorifies very evil things, and yet I just chalk it up to it's just a joke. Well, what's the punchline? What's so funny about it, right? Like, who's laughing really? No, you get your mad bald scowl face on, you go get in the pit and you go crash into other people, right? It's just like, I just that was just one of the things that I just started thinking through, like, why am I listening to this when this actually is singing the praises of something, a lifestyle that I don't actually live. And that's when I started kind of shifting my musical, not necessarily the style of music. I still enjoy the same style of music, but I enjoy it being played by Christians who are creating Christ-centered lyrics rather than music that worships the devil
in the style of Baroque classical.
Exactly right. Yeah, you know me.
Yeah, those guys go hard.
Yep, the old harpsichord. Jamming on the harpsichord.
All right. So yes, the 3 laws of logic. But then now, what do we do when we start recognizing, wow, there's certain reasoning that's bad out there? How do I make sense of that? Is there a way to kind of categorize bad reasoning? That way I can immediately call it out for what it is and then know how to change course. And what we're talking about here are logical fallacies.
Yep.
And I'm sure maybe our audience is very well familiar. Maybe you've heard the term, but you're not exactly familiar with exactly what those are. And we'll get into it in a bit, but let me just press pause here and real quick just speak to audience. Thank you for joining us. You're watching Studio 118. We're talking about the rules of reality and the laws of logic. And we're broadcasting live here at Calvary South Austin. We're on YouTube live streaming. We invite you to jump on that live chat and say hi. But of course, we invite you to send in your questions. We have a Q&A portion after our discussion where we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your questions. If there's anything that you've heard so far, you might need some clarification, or perhaps you disagree with us, that's totally fine. Send in your question and we would love to give a response. Again, if you're watching on Austin Cable Access Channel 11 and you want to send in your question, you can call it in at 512-576-5433. Again, that number is 512-576-5433. So we've talked about the principles, the 12 first principles of intelligibility. We've talked about the 3 laws of logic that really just govern our reasoning and how simple and easy to remember they are and how we take them for granted. And now we're going to get into, logical fallacies. And logical fallacies are basically errors in reasoning.
Right.
That's what it boils down to. But now, there's so many of them, and we're only going to touch on a few of them, but we really want to just help our audience kind of get a surface level understanding and really introduce you to some of the more common ones. That way, again, like if you're more like me, once you understand some of these more common ones, you're going to start seeing them and hearing them everywhere. And you're going to want to call them out, especially on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, wherever you're at. Does anybody do any of the other Chinese ones? What are the other ones called? I have no idea. I just know TikTok. All right, so there's 2 kinds of fallacies that a bad reasoning can kind of fall into a certain bucket. There's formal fallacies and there's informal. I want to touch on the formal just because...
I don't think we're dressed right for that.
Yeah, we didn't really dress the part, sorry. But either way, the show must go on. Formal I do want to touch on these just because they are relevant. Again, it's one of those things where you just kind of, it's intuitive and we take it for granted. And I think when we put it in this kind of format, it'll make sense. But just to let you know that it exists. So formal fallacies are really just, they're bad. They're errors in reasoning, but when you're trying to come up with a very specific argument, it's the way that you arrange your argument. That's what's wrong. So, for instance, in logic, there are types of arguments, and the way you arrange them are called, syllogisms, right? And they're really just, you set up premises that, okay, if these things are true, therefore they lead to a certain conclusion, right?
Premise 1, statement. Premise 2, statement, conclusion.
Yeah.
And it should follow.
Yeah, and so one of the ways that these kind of syllogisms are laid out are like this: if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, right? If it's let's say if it's wet outside, it must be raining. It's wet outside, therefore it's raining.
Yeah.
Right. So
fallacy.
So the way that you can kind of tell that these things are arranged correctly, the correct way of arranging this is if P then Q, P then Q. That's the way we kind of just, our brains understand. Yeah, that follows from that easily. The way to fallaciously and erroneously arrange this argument is if you go if P then Q, Q therefore P.
Right.
Right. So you basically reverse your reasoning and say, well, going back, I said the fallacious way first, but basically if you say, well, if it's wet outside, it must be raining.
Yes.
Well, that's not necessarily true, right? So we kind of know just intuitively if we're speaking erroneously, but just to let you know, it's a way of arranging your arguments in such a way that you can kind of tell, no, that doesn't follow from that.
Right.
And so always be on the lookout. If somebody's trying to present an argument to you in a very step-by-step method, pay attention to whether or not each of those things follow from the previous one. And that's the main thing I want to mention there, is that just always keep your ears attuned to what people are trying to present as an argument to you, especially if it's in a step-by-step method. Just, does that follow?
Yeah.
If I take that to its logical conclusion, is that actually the conclusion that's going to come out of this reasoning, right?
And that works both with whether they're trying to affirm the conclusion or deny it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so just keep that in your mind. I don't want to get into too many examples of like how to actually do this, but just always know and just kind of be on the lookout. Question a lot of the reasoning. And like I made a joke earlier, but like especially with politicians, right? They always kind of want us to see the doom and gloom that's coming, right? 12 years to extinction, that kind of stuff. But they're trying to lay out, if we don't change this now, the conclusion is this is going to happen. And ask yourself, is that really the case?
Yeah.
Does that actually follow?
Is that really an inconvenient truth?
For some it is, for some it is.
It's a very convenient fallacy.
Yes, very good.
Wow.
So just be aware of that the way people speak, it matters, and you can kind of tell if the things they're saying follow from each other and they lead to the conclusion. But I think the more often than not, we're going to come across these informal fallacies that they don't have to do anything with the arrangement of the argument. They really are just errors in kind of bad assumptions or bad definitions that are being used. So they have nothing to do with the arrangement of the argument itself. And
an informal fallacy doesn't necessarily mean that the person presenting it, their conclusion is automatically wrong, right?
Yes,
because and let me just dive into fallacy.
Yes.
Because you can right. It's a fallacy within a fallacy within a fallacy. But someone can present a fallacious argument and still have a correct conclusion, right? Yes. They just argued poorly to get there, right? So that is we don't want to just out of the box here insist that, well, if somebody does use if someone ends up using one of these fallacious arguments, these informal fallacies, doesn't mean that they're automatically wrong. Mm-hmm. But the chances are.
Yeah, it means that they do not have proper justification for believing
That's
what
right.
they do, right?
It's a weak argument.
It's a weak argument, exactly. So why don't we get into some of these informal fallacies and
Let's do
we
it.
can kind of give examples along the way. And I'm sure our audience here will recognize a lot of these. And now you just get to put a name to them. You get to put a little tag or label on them and say, aha, this is what you've been committing this whole time. So tomorrow, your workday will be a lot of fun. The first informal fallacy we got for you is the straw man argument here. The straw man argument is essentially when let's say you've presented, let's talk, we're defending Christianity here, right? Let's say I presented an argument for God, and you, Bunjee, you want to argue against me, but what you do is that you take my argument and you pick a weak part and you misrepresent it in some way, and you defeat that argument, and you think that you defeated my real argument.
Right. Or you restate the argument in such a way that doesn't really reflect, the actual argument, but you've restated it in such a way that it's easily defeated.
Yeah.
So the concept is that you've set up a straw man, which is easy to tear down.
Exactly.
You're not actually addressing the actual argument that I've presented.
Yeah, how many times in arguments, and we're asking our audience here, how many times in arguments that you've had over something, significant that you really, I'm dying on this mountain or something, have you said, I didn't say that, or that's not what I said, that's not what I meant.
Yeah.
What you're really accusing that person of doing is setting up a straw man argument against your argument.
Yeah.
And so this happens all the time.
Yeah.
And really this happens when we don't define terms a lot of the times.
True.
We're talking past each other. We misunderstand one another. Or also it could be on the person delivering the argument's part where they just haven't been clear enough
Right.
of what they actually mean to say and really just lay it out explicitly. And the other person's just making bad assumptions. So it could be on both sides.
Right.
But most of the time, nothing's really getting proved at that point.
And that's why it's good for Christians, if we are going to engage in these sorts of debates and conversations with others, that when they're on the side of, oh, no, you're misrepresenting what I said, or they're saying you're not properly representing my argument, that we allow for that we back away. If they've miscommunicated or we misunderstood their point of view, it doesn't make sense to just continue to pound on it and tear down a straw man. You're not going to get anywhere with that. So why not be gracious and just say, okay, well, take another stab at it. Help me to understand where you're coming from, and then move on from there.
Yeah, I think that I've heard the opposite of a straw man. What you want to do is create a steel man argument. Is saying, give me your strongest case, and then let's see if I can poke holes in that and actually tear that down.
Yeah.
And then I will have debunked your argument or whatever the case may be, right? So as Christians, we definitely don't want to be committing this informal fallacy, the straw man argument. We want to make sure that when people are presenting their arguments to us for, let's say, why God doesn't exist or why God is evil, or there's contradictions in the Bible and that kind of stuff, we want to make sure we properly understand what they've given us, process it, and then come back to them and say, hey, this is why I believe you're wrong. You've misunderstood, blah, blah, blah. But we don't want to just go in, Leroy Jenkins style and just tear down what we think are the actual arguments, and they're saying, I didn't really say that at all. And then you just kind of ruined your time with them.
Yeah, we don't need any Don Quixotes.
There you go, nice. So that's the straw man argument. Another one that we hear plenty of, especially in this information age, is the ad hominem. The ad hominem kind of sounds like hominy, but
kind of, but that would be corny.
Yeah. Do you like corn, by the way?
I do. I do, especially when it's been soaking.
Nice. So the ad hominem, it really is a Latin phrase that means to the man, and this is really a logical fallacy that means that rather than attacking the argument of the person, you're attacking the character of the person, and saying, aha, because you're this type of person, therefore your argument is false. Right? Like you said, even if a person argues their way poorly to a certain conclusion, that conclusion can be true. Even if the person is right in their conclusion and they're a jerk, just because you point out that they're a jerk doesn't automatically make their argument false.
Right.
Right.
I've heard Christians present some pretty bad arguments, though I agree with the conclusion that Christianity is true. But yeah, I remember sitting on a TV show that I did back some years ago, and I sat there with an atheist, and we discussed it, and I gave him the majority of the show time to just highlight some of the worst arguments he's ever heard from Christians. And I sat there with him just going, yep, that's a horrible argument. Yep, so yeah, I mean, I've heard some Christians making just some really bad arguments. I'm sure I've made a few of my own. But yeah, you don't want to just attack a person who makes a weak argument, verbally attacking them and tearing down their position because of they've got a huge nose or they're overweight or whatever the case like that. These sorts of arguments don't fly. Attacking the person doesn't disprove the argument.
Yeah, I think one way that I've heard it put, especially come from skeptics, right, is they point out, let's say, all the atrocities that so-called Christians have committed in the past. Therefore, Christianity is false. Right? So they point out and say, look at all these bad people. They're bad, aren't they? Therefore, Christianity false.
Yeah.
Say, it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
We need to be able to point out, you're just attacking bad people. And I'm right there with you. I'll stand right next to you and say, yeah, bad person.
So there's hypocrites in the church?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So can we actually talk about what actually is the underpinning for Christianity? What makes it true or false? Let's get away from pointing out, there's hypocrites everywhere.
Yep.
So that's ad hominem. And again, as Christians, we don't want to be guilty of this.
We don't want to, unless they're short.
Yeah.
And then you can just attack them all day long.
Down with short people, that's what I say. Let's see, another informal fallacy that we hear touted all the time is equivocation. Equivocation, just a fancy term that means you're changing definitions on the fly, right? And this happens again a lot. Like I said, whenever you find yourself saying, I didn't mean it that way, or I didn't say that, chances are, as we said, it's either a straw man or it's a straw man by way of equivocating, right? So if you start changing definitions, if you say, this is my argument and I mean this, and then all of a sudden you start changing the goalposts, moving the goalposts, saying, well, I didn't really mean that, this is what I mean now, you're equivocating.
Right.
You're not reasoning well. And so you need to find a definition, work with it, and see if it works. If not, throw it out and work with another one. Right?
And I find this argument oftentimes, or this form of argumentation, in those who are too proud to admit when they've been wrong about something.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a good one.
This is really where this is typically used. If somebody says, well, here's my argument, and I go, well, here's why that doesn't make sense. Here's why that's irrational or illogical or doesn't line up with the facts or whatever the case. And so they start shifting the argument, and rather than, oh no, you've misunderstood me, they start pretending like that wasn't, they were just making another argument all along. And so, yeah, and that's where, as Christians, again, just appealing back to, the believers that, if we've made an argument that's weak and maybe based in some weak reasoning or fallacious arguments, and somebody calls us out, we just do well to just go, yeah, good point. I'll give you that one. We shouldn't be so proud that we can't just say, I blew it on that one. That wasn't a strong argument. I'll give you that. Let's try it again. Right. Yeah. This whole equivocation, attempt to, just continue to try to be right, even though clearly your argument was wrong. Yeah. It's silly. Yeah. There's no point in it.
And as I was mentioning earlier in the episode, how Lawrence Krauss equivocates on the word nothing.
Right.
You take a word that has had a very certain meaning, just etymologically. Can't speak today. Nothing means something. And he's now changing the definition to kind of throw in all these extra things, this added baggage here to the word nothing. trying to pass it off as if it's always been common parlance to use the word nothing in this way.
He conflates, zero and nothingness, or equivocates between these two concepts, and pretends like it means the same thing when it doesn't.
Yeah. So be aware of, and this is why it's very important, I believe, especially when you're starting off on a conversation, especially if it's about like theological significance or anything like that. Try to define terms right at the outset and say, hey, when you use that word, I think of it this way. How are you defining it? And that way we can work off your definition and we can see if that actually works.
And in that way, you're using the law of identification.
There you go. It all comes back to those 3 laws somehow. All right, so that's equivocation. Next, we have argument from ignorance.
I'm guilty of this all the time.
Yeah, ignoramus, as we like to call you. No, this is what I also like to call is the argument from silence, right? Essentially, you say, because something wasn't mentioned or never came up in an argument, therefore, that's false, right? And the way I've always heard, especially surrounding Jesus, is that, well, if Jesus really existed, then we would have heard more about him in other ancient writers, right? Historical writers. Therefore, Jesus didn't exist. Insane. Is that the way it works?
All the while ignoring all of the extra biblical historical accounts that do,
Those don't count.
Of course not. Yeah,
those don't count.
Yeah, another form of this is, well, no one's ever proven that to be true, or no one's ever proven that to be false, right? Yeah. And that's another appeal to ignorance.
Yeah. Therefore, that answer stands.
Yes.
Right. It's kind of like the lazy way out. Right, it's just saying, well, I don't really want to have to argue anything that's been said.
No one's ever proven that there's a God.
Yes.
Therefore, there's no God.
Therefore, I'm certain.
Appeal to ignorance. Yeah.
Yes. How about appeal to popularity? This is a popular one. Yeah.
It is.
It is. So appeal to popularity essentially means, look at all these people that.
What's the deal?
What's the deal? Look at all these people that agree with me. Therefore, I'm right.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that good reasoning?
Well, that's climate science.
Yeah.
90% of the yada yada yada. Therefore,
but we'll never tell you the specific question they answered.
The science is settled because of all these scientists. Just kind of like, well, you just because you ignore all the scientists that reject this.
Is that the way science works?
Yeah. So let me get this right. Science is based on popular vote.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so appeal to popularity. The one question I like to ask is, especially when people start pointing out, look at all these, people that agree with me and saying, well, where's the threshold, basically? So
nice job,
if we get enough people,
nice job, Copernicus.
There you go. if we say, I just like to say, what's the threshold? Can you tell me when was the number of people that agreed with your certain conclusion? When did you turn from disbelieving to believing? What was that threshold, and why? And why is that not arbitrary, basically? So essentially, they just like to say, people are on my side. And again, with all the way the scientific industry is the way it is today, you can find so many studies that say the opposite as well. And so appeal to popularity just proves nothing in the end.
Back when I was researching a lot more of the COVID stuff and all that, it's just like, man, masks, the virus, the treatments. I could find a study that would support any point of view on any of it, right?
Yeah.
I had no problem finding a bunch of studies that were pro-mask and a bunch of studies that were, opposed.
Yeah. In a related one, I want to jump down and we'll jump back up, but a related one here is appeal to authority.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think these go hand in hand. And we experienced this again just during the whole COVID season. I remember seeing, in my place of employment, people on the chat channels talking about, well, do you have a PhD? Are you able to read the studies correctly? Basically, like I have the necessary tools in my tool belt to be able to properly analyze and dissect whatever conclusions. And essentially, just saying, you're too dumb.
Yeah.
You don't have the qualifications I do or other people do. Therefore, you're wrong.
It's almost like an ad hominem but
Yes, wrapped up
but not pointing at you. Let me appeal to another man, the expert out there.
Yes, yeah, appeal to an expert, basically.
Yes.
So whenever you start hearing essentially people pointing and saying, well, such and such authority says, and therefore that settles it, haven't we been told question everything? Again, that doesn't necessarily point to anything being true or false. That just is one person. They could be right. They could be right. But what makes them right is the actual reasoning behind what they're writing or saying, right? That's what we need to get at. You can't just point to a person and say, this person said something, therefore, right.
Yeah.
It's not the way
But they're the expert.
Yeah.
I remember at UT campus one time, I was talking with a biology professor, and we were out inviting people to come watch this video on Mount St. Helens that, presented a young Earth point of view. And this guy comes up, you don't believe this, do you? This is ridiculous. And I'm just kind of like, well, yeah, I do. And why don't you come on out and you can be a part of the discussion? And he was just kind of like, well, if clearly you haven't taken a college level biology course. And I said, do you mean to suggest that everyone who takes a college-level biology course will automatically become an evolutionist? Because if that's what you believe, let me introduce you to a long list of very credentialed biologists who are young Earth creationists, and he's not willing to accept those experts. Yeah. He's only going to appeal to the authorities that agree with him. And so the appeal to authority, it's a half-baked argument, because I can also go find authorities that disagree with your authorities, and so now we're at a bypass between our authoritative sources. Yeah. So it's not a good argument.
Yeah, and if you're in our audience this evening and you're wondering, well, at the same time, I don't have that time to go and read white papers and scientific journals and whatnot. I totally get it. But this is where the 3 laws of logic
that Netflix isn't going to watch itself.
That's true. That's good. But at the same time, that's where I want to appeal now to the 3 laws of logic.
Yeah.
Really just get to know the 3 laws of logic, and that will be all you need in your tool belt to really just have those red flags go up and say, that doesn't sound right. I don't quite know what the true answer is. I just know that that's not right. Based on the laws of logic. Mm-hmm. And that will get you 80% of the way, as they say, right? 80-20 rule here. So just get to know the 3 laws of logic, and this will get you most of the way there. Let's consider a couple more informal fallacies here. One of my favorites, if not my favorite, is the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy, essentially saying that something is either true or false purely based on where it came from.
Right.
Okay. And the way I've heard this one, especially in arguments about God or Christianity, is you're only a Christian because you live in America, right? If you were born in Iraq or something, or Malaysia, you'd be a Muslim. Therefore, Christianity is false. And that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
It's saying just because of where your belief came from makes it either true or false. And that's just bad reasoning.
Yep.
Let's get rid of this.
Yep.
Also, it could be, related to the ad hominem, but essentially saying if this belief system arose out of a culture that was backwards or barbaric or something like that, it can't possibly be true, right? And so always just kind of be on the lookout or be on the listen out for when people start appealing to where did this belief come from, and no other argument, and just saying now it's true or false, they're probably committing the genetic fallacy.
And it could come from the belief system of the individual, right? So, that person believed this, therefore everything they said was false.
There you go. Yeah, everything.
Really?
Yeah. Okay.
It works like that, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about in one of our classes yesterday, our youth class, about what culture believes just in general about rich people, and how we're very quick to just categorize, throw all the rich, they're all greedy, and I just asked, are they all greedy? And most of the time they're just quick to backpedal and say, well, not all, right? But that's quickly how culture can just grab a hold of a certain concept, and
Right.
it just spreads and just say, this whole category are this, and therefore, let's be against them or be for them,
Right.
And we as Christians definitely need to be careful, especially in this very highly charged, politically charged culture that we're in, that we want to be slow to sort of pick sides, whether you pick a side or not, and make sure that it's not purely based on just, I like this person, I like their good heart, and therefore everything they say is true.
Right.
They did that one bad thing, therefore everything out of their mouth is from the devil, something like that.
Yep.
So let's be careful of the genetic fallacy. A couple more here. Another one is the naturalistic fallacy. And this one I just like to call it arguing from an is to an ought. And one of the popular ways that I've heard this argument go down is, for instance, like in a biology course, talking about evolution, is saying, because you see like homosexual activity happening amongst the animal kingdom, therefore it is morally good among humans, because we see it happening in the animal kingdom, right? They're arguing from what they view just naturally occurring and saying it ought to be something that should be celebrated, right?
Right.
Or just should be normalized,
Right.
in human society.
But they don't make the same argument for, say, like, when, a lion murders a gazelle.
Yeah.
Well, we see murder happening in the animal kingdom, so therefore, nope, they don't like that argument, right?
Or in certain species where the female always winds up killing the male.
Yeah, sure. Right.
Thank you for your job well done. Die.
We just legalized femme fatale.
Yeah. Yeah, so they always pick and choose.
Yeah.
It's probably called special pleading as well.
Right, yeah.
But yes, naturalistic fallacy is arguing from an is to a not. And here's this next one that we've been talking, kind of sneak peeking for a little bit, is false dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned how there's the law of excluded middle. There's either A or non-A. But some people never truly present that true dilemma. And they give you a false binary choice.
Right.
I don't know if you want to say more on that, the way you've heard it.
Yeah, sure. So you could see that in the argument of, is Jesus God or is he man?
Yeah.
And they present that as a false dichotomy, because the Bible says that he's both and.
Yeah.
That he's both God and man. He's the God-man. So when people come along and say, well, either Jesus is God or he's a man, he can't be both, when, in actuality, that's a false dichotomy, because, yeah, he is both and.
Yeah. And the way you can identify that it's a false dilemma here is that being human and being God are not opposites of one another.
Right. It's not a contradiction to be the God-man. It's not common.
Yeah.
It's very uncommon.
Yes. But it's not a true opposite being presented, right?
Right.
The probably famous false dilemma being given is the argument against God from evil. Either God is not good, or he's not powerful. Then where does evil come from? Basically, he's not able to. Therefore, God does not exist. Essentially, arguing that
Right.
he's either not a good God or he's not powerful enough. And those are your only two choices, right? And we want to say, well, no, there must be another choice, because these essentially are not opposites of one another. And so there's what they call is splitting the horns of the dilemma, saying there's a third option. And so be aware. If they're trying to pin you or corner you into choosing this option, A or B, ask yourself, is that truly the opposite of one another?
Yeah.
If not, there's got to be some other option.
We find the same thing with Calvinism and Arminianism. They tend to present it as you're either a Calvinist or you're an Arminianist, all the while failing to remember middle knowledge.
Come on, man. It's there.
And then I remember one time I was having a conversation about the laws of logic and talking about how the binary laws of logic are the basis for rational thinking, and so after the show was over, I walked out into an area where people could see what was happening on television there. So there was a guy who had been watching the show, and he was just kind of like, "You're all wrong. You got it all wrong. You need to come up to the trinary logic level. You're still stuck in this binary way of thinking." And we've evolved, and now we've adopted this trinary logic. And I said, so let me get this right. So I either use trinary logic or I think poorly.
User error.
He goes, yeah. And I said, well, let me slow that down for you a little bit. I either use binary or trinary logic, or I think poorly. And he goes, I see your point.
Yeah.
So the problem that he was having was that he was trying to use binary logic to prove his trinary logic, which you have to do.
Yes.
In order to establish using trinary logic, it has to be based in the binary.
Can't throw the baby out with bathwater.
And that's right. That's right. So yeah, he walked away from the conversation realizing that while trinary logic is a valid form of reasoning at times, he was presenting a false dichotomy between either this or that, and when there's yet another option.
Did he leave trying to clap with one hand?
I don't know. I don't maybe.
Those
I didn't hear it.
I didn't hear it.
So maybe
he was. Hold on to trinary logic. Yeah, so these are just a smattering of logical fallacies and informal fallacies that, again, you're going to start probably seeing and hearing a lot more of now that you kind of can put a label on these and say, that's what this person, or that's what I've been committing this whole time. Let me get away from that and let me really buckle down on a good reasoning, and that way I can present a stronger argument. So if you need any more review, feel free to catch the replay of this episode. That way you can get some more information. Also, I'd like to plug there's bunch of websites that are dedicated to just presenting logical fallacies, but an easy one to remember is probably just logicalfallacies.info, and that'll give you some more explanations on many, many more logical fallacies that you can detect. So now we get into a little bit of a deeper conversation about the laws of logic, because we've reasoned our way to the laws of logic. We see how they're being used or misused in just everyday life. But now we want to say, well, do they actually point us to a certain worldview, or do they actually point us to God, and which God, right? Yeah. And this is something that we did talk about in our last episode, but we really want to make the connection explicit here. So what is it about the laws of logic that we can kind of extract and understand about them that then lead us now to an argument for God? What do you think?
Well, so we've kind of already set the stage for this when we were talking about those first principles, right? So we recognize that for there to be contingent beings, which there's two right here, then there must be an uncaused creator, a necessary being who exists, in infinity. Yeah. And so therefore has always existed, always will exist, and needs no cause, right? So that's kind of established in those first principles of thought. But then we can move forward to what's been called the transcendental argument for God, or TAG for short. And it's important to understand that there are variations of this transcendental argument for the existence of God. I mean, you can take this, there's a couple different ways to even start defining transcendental. There's, a couple different approaches, using the laws of morality, or using the uniformity of nature. And there's a couple different ways to go about this. But in this case, for our conversation tonight, what I'm talking about is the transcendent nature of absolute logic as being strong evidence for the existence of God. So in other words, when I take the laws of logic and I ask, what could possibly justify these abstract, immaterial, universal laws? Yeah. What would justify these laws, right? And you start arriving at the fact that there must be a God. There must be a creator who has created these laws of logic for us, so that we can try to understand, how to think rationally about reality, right? So at the same time, the tag or the transcendental argument for God also disproves atheism. And the reason why is because atheism can't justify the existence of these laws of logic. And the reason why I say this is because the atheist is a materialist. And as a materialist, the materialist has to consign the laws of logic to the chemical reactions happening in the brain of the individual. Mm-hmm. How can you possibly how can the chemicals occurring in your brain, like you didn't have lunch today, I had a small lunch today, and that affected the chemical reactions happening in our brains even right now, and so why would we expect the chemical reactions happening in your brain producing your laws of logic to be the same as my laws of logic? And so atheists can't justify the existence of universal, invariable, undeniable, immaterial laws of logic. So these laws of logic, they're abstract entities, which is to say that they're immaterial in nature, right? And not only that, but the laws of logic are also then universal, because anywhere I go, the laws of logic are still the same. Yeah. And I would even argue in that period of time before mankind was created on the planet, the laws of logic were still true. Yeah. Even though there wasn't an Adam or an Eve to then, use the if, then, either, or, neither, nor forms of logic, right? And so the laws of logic can't just be chemical reactions happening in the brain. It's got to be beyond the brain, and it's got to be beyond the universe, because they govern the entire universe, and so they're transcendent in that sense, right?
They're metaphysical.
Yes, that's exactly right. So with that, atheists can't account for these immaterial, universal, metaphysical, abstract laws of logic, and it's for this reason that Dr. Greg Bahnsen declared this in his debate with Gordon Stein. He says this: I suggest that we can prove the existence of God from the impossibility of the contrary. The transcendental proof for God's existence is that without him, it is impossible to prove anything. The atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. The atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the ability for the mind to understand the world, and moral absolutes.
That's tag plus.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's just, Bahnsen was a master on this argument. Yeah. And Gordon Stein didn't recover, from this debate either.
Because from that point on, he just kept saying, justify yourself.
Right.
You're speaking in an intelligible way. I'm asking you to justify how you can even do that as an atheist.
It's not to say that atheists don't try to use the laws of logic. Right. It's to say that when they do, they don't have a justification for why anybody else should follow their laws of logic. Mm-hmm. So the atheist who comes along and says, well, you should think rationally according to these laws. Well, why? Why can't I have other laws of logic?
Yeah. I'm over here on this branch of the evolutionary chain.
Why can't bother me? Why can't I have the law of contradiction? Yeah. The law of non-identity, why can't I just have my own laws of logic? Well, who's to say that the atheist gets to determine the laws of logic that everyone else in the entire universe should use? So the minute they try to force others to use the universal laws of logic, what they're doing is they're smuggling in the logic that God created for mankind. Yeah. And yet they have no preconditions for intelligibility. They have no basis for science. Because why would they expect that tomorrow is going to be like today? Exactly. Why would they believe in the uniformity of nature, which then provides the basis for scientific inquiry? Yep. Why wouldn't we just assume if it's an atheistic universe and things just pop into existence and disappear and change willy-nilly, and there's no mechanism for evolution, and yet things just evolve, and hearts of giraffes and all these sorts of things? Why? Yeah, it's a fun, yeah. That was last month or 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, last month.
So why does the atheist then press people to use the laws of logic that they have no real justification for?
Yep. And all this is predicated upon the assumption that, again, what we're trying to pinpoint is that as an atheist, you're by default a materialist. And so if you have to find your answers within the material world, you're going to be hard-pressed to do so, right? And you just can't, because of the way we have understood the laws of logic. They're immaterial, and they're universal, they're binding, that's why they're laws.
That's right.
In a materialistic universe, simply cannot account for that by definition.
Right. Yeah, and I remember having this conversation with an atheist one time, and I asked him to provide me with some level of justification for him expecting the both of us to be using the same laws of logic, and he proceeded to just give me a very elaborate answer that just really boiled down to, it's just that way.
Yes.
And he talked about the way that the universe works and functions and gravity and orbits and all these sorts of things. And at the end of it, it's just that way. Logic is just that way. Yeah. Well, that's an argument from what? Ignorance.
Yeah.
It's just an argument from ignorance. And one that we didn't mention, it's begging the question.
Yes.
Right?
He's basically assumed himself to his conclusion.
So it's an irrational point of view to suggest that you can have universal immaterial laws of logic that are completely binding on every single person, regardless of whether they know the laws or not. If you step out in front of the bus, it's either you or the bus.
Yes.
Everywhere you go. Right. Yep. So with that, the transcendental argument for God is, in my opinion, just a very strong argument for the existence of God, because as Bonson puts it in his argument here, the atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. The atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic.
Yep.
They use them. They just can't justify them, right? So that's where we see that from the first principles that we talked about. We talked about the 12 principles, the first principles of thinking or rationality that produces or gives us the three laws of logic: if, then, either, or, neither, nor. And from there, we can see then that this is something that God has created, right? So the laws of logic demand theism as a worldview.
Yes.
But then taking it further, as we start examining all the different gods, as we start examining the standard works of the different religious belief systems out there that claim to come from a god or gods, as we start examining each one of them, we start, if we're going to use the law, so think about it like this: the laws of logic are reflective of the mind of God, right? Yep. So the creator God, the uncaused cause, would give us laws of logic that reflect who he is. That's one of those first principles of rational thinking, right? Yeah. The analogous aspect of who we are and how we think should reflect our creator. So therefore, if we start examining all the standard works of religious systems to see what kind of God they're offering, or gods, what we quickly discover is that there's only one of them that actually lines up with the laws of logic.
Yeah. Is it Buddhism?
No. Buddhism really doesn't even point to God, right? So they're effectively atheist.
Yeah, they're effectively atheist. That's true.
So, but when you look at polytheism, when you look at panentheism or pantheism, when you look at Unitarian monotheism, like Islam or Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, when you look at these, different gods, all of a sudden you start realizing that all of these gods are very irrational. Whether it's statements that they make or the concepts of their theology, you start seeing that there's only one God that actually lines up with the laws of logic, and it's the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so ultimately the tag argument points us to the God of the Bible.
Yeah, that's great.
Who then has revealed himself to us through the incarnation of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and that's where, man, I love how this is all come together, and this is why it's very important as, again, I'm coming from a background of, when I grew up with knowledge of the Bible, growing up in a church environment and all this, never heard any of this kind of talk that we need to be thinking critically, thinking about laws of logic and applying them to our own worldview, and then thinking hard about other worldviews. We just assumed those are wrong, we're true. Why are they true? It's just true. It's just begging the question.
Which is a fallacious argument, though the conclusion is correct.
Right. But we were never challenged or encouraged to think critically and kind of put our own beliefs under the microscope and say, hey, where are you wrong? Where are you right? How can we defend ourselves? And now, having become a Christian as an adult and having discovered the laws of logic for myself, and now starting to apply all these things, and then now reading the Bible through that lens with a fresh perspective of, okay, can I apply this to the Scriptures? And you're right on, is that the Bible stands above and head and shoulders above the rest. And I just wanted to point out just a couple of examples about how we see, especially in the New Testament, especially when Jesus, who's called the Word, the Logos, we'll get into that in a bit, but when we start seeing, if we understand him to be God in the flesh, we should be able to see hints of this logical way of thinking,
right,
in the way he lived his life and his teachings, right? And we do see that, and I just wanted to at least point out perhaps just one example here as we have time, but starting in Matthew chapter 12, this is a classic example of Jesus just kind of taking the Pharisees to the woodshed, the logical woodshed, as it were. And, the Pharisees were just always big, harping on, you're breaking the Sabbath law, you're breaking the Sabbath rules and whatnot. And this particular example in Matthew chapter 12, the first 8 verses, where they find the disciples where they were plucking the heads of grain on the Sabbath, and apparently that's against, the law. You can't do that, and there's no work to be done on the Sabbath. And they start complaining to Jesus. And Jesus has, a couple of roads he can go down here. And what's the most effective way of showing them, are they wrong? Are they right? How is he going to approach this? And what he does is just a mastermind of using logical thinking against the Pharisees. So what he does is, first of all, he points out their logical inconsistencies by showing them, first of all, there's other examples that the Pharisees would have to agree with and say, well, those were okay. One of them was, well, back in the Old Testament, David and his mighty men, when they were hungry and they were trying to get back home, they actually plucked grain from people's fields on the Sabbath, or from the temple, as it were, and that's usually against the law.
Yeah, they ate the old bread,
the showbread,
the old showbread. Yep.
Usually against the law, but in that case, an exception was made, and the Pharisees would have to concede that because it's obviously in their scriptures, and, and it was a good thing that was done. So he shows them something that they would agree with that goes against what they're complaining about currently, and then he goes on to show them that he goes beyond that, and now he starts showing them, look, you've missed the forest for the trees. Essentially, you're concentrating on the letter of the law when you should be concentrating on the spirit of the law, and showing that God's mind is not about just living by the letter of the law, and if you break it, in any one direction, God's not going to care what your reasoning was. He's just going to punish you. So they were wrong on two fronts. But what Jesus did was point out their illogical thinking on this by showing them two examples that happen in the Old Testament, where essentially this is the same example, just different characters in the story. And you agree with those, but now just because you don't like me, now you're complaining about my disciples.
Genetic fallacy.
What are you going to do here, right? And so, and he just masterfully plays against these examples that they have to agree with, and he just shuts them down.
Right.
And so there's other examples that are found in the New Testament here where Jesus, over and over, he's just using the laws of logic, and then also beautifully putting it to the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the scribes, whatever leaders of the day that were trying to entrap him. And he's always putting them in the corner, just by showing their logical inconsistency, their illogical thinking.
And no one puts Jesus in the corner.
No one puts Jesus in the corner. And so I encourage you, we point out Matthew chapter 12. There's also an example in Luke chapter 20, verses 27 through 40. And then also I didn't have another one, but just Luke chapter 20. But also just look at all the conversations he has with the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the scribes. And you'll see, he pointed out this hypocrisy. He pointed out these illogical conclusions, a reductio ad absurdum. He's saying, if you actually live this out, this is where you're going to get. So it's false because you can't actually live it out.
Right.
So he does this time and time again. So he's just a masterful logician, as it were. And it makes sense because he's God in the flesh and he's actually reflecting his own nature.
That's right. Yeah, we see John pointing that out in John chapter 1. There John writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that's a very interesting statement there. In the beginning was the Word was with God, showing that there is some sort of distinction. And the Word was God, showing that there is a connection there, that they're the same, they're equivalent, right? And then John says he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. And then later on he says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But it's in the English where we find the Greek being translated word, but the Greek that's being translated word, in the beginning was the Word. The Greek word is actually logos. So John's saying here, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And then verse 14, the Logos tabernacled amongst us, right? But this word Logos, that as John is referring to the divine nature of Jesus, he's talking about the Logos, which is the Greek root for our English word logic. And that's very interesting. Jesus is being called, the divine nature of Jesus is being called the Logos, and the word Logos is used in respect to the mind. It's used in reference to reason, or the mental faculty of thinking, meditating, reasoning, and calculating. There was a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus who first used the term Logos around 600 BC, and he used it to designate the divine reason or plan which coordinates a changing universe. And so then John comes along 600 years later, 600 plus, and then uses this word from Heraclitus and uses the word logos, this divine reasoning or divine mind, in reference to the second person of the triune Godhead. And so within the Christian theology, we have the one God, and within the Godhead we find the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or we might say the Father, the Logos, and the Holy Spirit, and then the Logos tabernacled amongst us as he took on humanity within the womb of the Virgin Mary, right? So you have the deity of Jesus Christ being referred to as the Logos, which in this context is the divine mind of God, or the divine logic of God. And John tells us that all things were created by the Logos and through him and for him. And that's interesting because so in the beginning is how John begins this. John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Logos. And that's exactly the same terminology that Moses uses back in Genesis chapter 1, where he tells us, in the beginning God created. Yeah. So you have the Father creating in Genesis chapter 1. You have the Holy Spirit hovering over the creation there in Genesis chapter 1. And now you find the Logos was there also acting as creator. So this is the uncaused, necessary being who has put into motion all other unnecessary beings, beginning with Adam and Eve. Yep. And it was in the divine logic of the Son that the preconditions for intelligibility were created. And I think we get a little glimpse of this in Proverbs chapter 8. It's there where Solomon writes, wisdom. So he's personifying wisdom here. He's personifying wisdom, and he writes, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and find out knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance and the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. Counsel is mine and sound wisdom. I am understanding. I have strength. By me kings reign and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule and nobles, all the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. I really have a belief here that, King Solomon here is poetically writing about the way that the Logos created the preconditions for intelligibility so that we could think rationally and for a very specific reason, which is what our show is named for.
Yes. As we say, Studio 118, we always open up by saying it's brought to you by Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18.
That's right.
And just to repeat that, right, this is where God himself is calling his people, and he says, come now, let us reason together. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be as wool. But he starts off by inviting his people to reason with him.
Come now, let's be reasonable.
Yeah.
Let's think reasonably about this. You have the stain of sin. I have the solution. That's basically what this verse says.
Yeah.
You've been stained with sin. I have a solution to clean you. Let's think reasonably about this, right? And all of this by design of the Logos, the divine mind of God, which is the divine nature of our Savior, Jesus Christ, the God-man. So it's incredible to consider how in the creation, God not only creates mankind, but then also, prior to this, creates these preconditions for intelligibility so that we can think reasonably about our relationship with our Creator, so that we can actually have a meaningful relationship with God.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I started thinking about, again, when I start comparing it against all the other religious systems and worldviews, what are they offering? So when we pick out something like Hinduism, and which allows for contradictions, which allows for multiple necessary beings, right? So there's no boundary for being reasonable or logical. Logical inconsistencies can exist, and they just have to kind of be fine with it and just kind of throw their hands in there and say, well, it's just kind of a mystery, let's say.
Right.
But that's the way that they've constructed their religious thinking. But at the outset, just allowing for inconsistencies. So then we have to say, well, if your God is going to reflect that illogical way of thinking, then that is not a God that actually exists, as we've been showing through the tag argument. But here we have the Christian God, the God of the Bible, showing us that he wants us to be reasonable. You start thinking about Islam and the way that Allah is described as. Sure, common attributes, although he's never called loving God. But he's very capricious in the way that he operates. He can forgive you at a moment's notice, or he can just say, no, to hell with you, right? It's all at a whim. There's no logical way of thinking. He can do whatever he wants, including be a hypocrite. He can deceive. And he can just go against his own nature and choose opposite things that don't make sense.
Right.
Things that you wouldn't expect, things that people wouldn't deserve, so to speak. And they have to be okay with that.
And this is what we would call a potential being. He has the potential to change. Mm. He has the potential to,
learn.
Sure. And that's not a rational approach at thinking about an infinite God, because an infinite God will be infinite in his attributes and therefore an actual being who does not change.
Yeah. So again, it's you could say, well, it's all fun, to theorize about laws of logic, and it's cool exercise to learn about fallacies, but when we start applying it to questions that matter the most, especially about our very, where did we come from? Who is God?
Yep.
Do these things matter? We can actually use this knowledge to now weed out false beliefs and false belief systems, and don't we all want to believe in true things? Surely we don't want to just believe in things just because they make us feel good. I know that's a popular thing nowadays, but when you get down to it, when you are living your life and life comes at you with trials, with the deep valleys, what is going to carry you through? Are you really wanting to put your trust in a belief system or a God that is capricious, that is illogical? Those gods don't exist. Those gods are impotent because they don't exist.
No, thank you.
You want a God that is inviting you. And that's one thing I've always appreciated, having now read the Bible with this new perspective of understanding laws of logic and whatnot. And now you begin to see so many examples throughout, especially the Old Testament, where God is calling his people. And he constantly says, don't you remember when I did these things? He's always constantly pointing them to evidence.
Right.
And this flies in the face of what skeptics always try to bash Christians about and say, Christianity is just a crutch.
Right.
It's illogical. It's incoherent. God is just this sky daddy that really just wants to, control your life. When all the while, when you actually read the testimonies of what God is doing, he's calling his people, he's always reminding them. He's not just saying, believe in me just because I said so.
Right.
And you just have to accept it.
That's right.
He's always pointing them, I've done these things. You know that I've done these
Let's
things.
think it through.
Exactly.
Let's be reasonable.
Let's be reasonable.
Look what I did already.
Yeah, look at the evidence.
Yeah.
And make a conclusion for yourself.
Yep. I remember it was back in, I think it was 2003, where I filled in when I was at Calvary Austin. I filled in for an elementary class. It was 4th and 5th graders, and it was just for the summer. The main teacher was going to be away for vacation, so I stepped in and developed a class just for the weeks that I had, where I took them through the first principles of rational thinking into the laws of logic, and then brought them to the logical conclusion that the God of the Bible is the true and living God, and He's revealed Himself in Jesus Christ. And so that was the whole course, helping them to process first principles, to embrace the laws of logic, to realize that this takes us to God, and then therefore the only logical God is the Logos, who is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. And those kids were blown away. Like, you could just see it. You could just see every week they were coming in just looking for the next tidbit, the next bit of information. And by the end of it, those kids, I've seen a lot of those kids continue to grow up, and now they're adults. But it was amazing to see how this just revolutionized their concept of who God is and why we can believe it. And of course, I pray that they'll continue to follow the Lord. But it's just a good example of how we desperately need to raise our kids with an understanding of the laws of logic and how they support and undergird our belief in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, if what you're saying is true, right, that we're designed this way with that innate understanding of laws of logic, and when we don't grow that in a person, when we withhold that from them, we're doing them a disservice, and we're just holding them back and just be fearful of the consequences later on when they're not able to, essentially reason their way through this world, when it's throwing a whole bunch of contradictions at them and temptations that are just subtly, there's a little bit of truth mixed in, but there's just enough, false nature to it that it can really poison you.
Right.
And if you don't have that good reasoning sense, you're going to be lost in that swamp, right?
Right. Yep.
Well, good. Hey, we're about to log off of Austin Cable Access Channel 11, but we're still going to be streaming on YouTube live stream. So we invite you to stick around on the live stream. If you're watching on Channel 11, jump on the live chat or the YouTube live stream, and we'll continue the conversation. We're about to end our conversation, then we'll have a Q&A portion, and then we'll be done. But stick around for a couple more minutes. We'll be back. All right, welcome back. We just logged off Channel 11, but we're still streaming strong on YouTube. Hey, we're about to just give our final thoughts here on our discussion portion on the rules of reality, the laws of logic, and then we're going to enter to our Q&A portion. So, we were just talking about how, we started out at the beginning saying how we've seen, laws of logic, critical thinking courses used to be default, mandated in even elementary.
Isaac Watts.
You got to refresh me on that.
Yeah. Isaac Watts was one of our early logicians who helped create logical courses for public schools.
Very nice.
Yep.
Yeah, but now we don't see any sign of that, and as we've been explaining, we see now the effects of that. We live in a culture that is just confused and steeped in just illogical thinking. We'd rather concentrate on, and like we said, we're violating in so many ways the laws of identity, and nobody's catching on.
Right.
Nobody's fighting back against this. And this is happening in our public school system and in our culture in general.
Yep.
We see the appeals to emotion, especially in commercials, in media, and people are drawn in by this rather than looking at, okay, what is the quality of this product? This is just a simple, easy way that we can see laws of logic are desperately needed in our culture.
Yes.
But we as Christians, I firmly believe that's where it needs to start. If our God is the one who is the source of the laws of logic, the principles of intelligibility. And so the church really needs to be at the forefront of thinking critically and really presenting these arguments in a cogent way.
Most certainly.
But, in many ways, we dropped the ball on that. But this is at least Studio 118 is trying to do, catch up in that way. But I don't know. I'd like to hear any closing thoughts that you have on the rules of reality before we get into our Q&A portion.
Well, I don't think anybody wants to live a lie. And, I've spoken before large crowds and small crowds, and when I've gone out and done a kind of an apologetic circuit and spoke, I've taught at youth events and these sorts of things, and oftentimes when I'm standing before youth, I've asked them, hands up, who wants to live a lie? Who wants to get to their 25th birthday and find out that their whole childhood they lived a lie, and of course there's always some knucklehead that raises their hand, but nobody wants, no kid likes to imagine one day finding out that their whole life up until that point was a lie or didn't correspond to reality. And that's so important for us to realize that nobody wants to live a life that is based in deception. We want our life to count. We want our life to matter. And we want our life to be in line with reality. And I remember when I was coming to faith in Jesus Christ, I remember realizing after I had taken that step of faith that my life had been a lie, that what I had been living for and all of my aims and goals in life had just been based in something that was just false. And it really made an impact. And at that point in time, that's when all I knew to do was just to say, you know what? The Bible presents us with the truth of God's word. And if I know what it says, then I won't live in deception anymore. And that's kind of what got me started on this path of knowing God's word, knowing the mind of God. That got me interested in logic, and that's when I started, looking into, how can I think logically and avoid fallacies and these sorts of things, right? So, with that, I would just say that, if you're watching this show and you've come to the realization that maybe your life has been less than real, so to speak, right, and rooted in something other than reality, if your thoughts and beliefs haven't been corresponding to reality, one of the best things that you can do is trust in Jesus Christ. He is the Logos of God. He is the divine mind, the logic of God. He has created the preconditions for intelligibility, and a relationship with Him is how we get our life on course with reality, and He will help us. He will then begin to transform our minds by the renewing of the mind mind, which comes from the washing of the water of the Word, He will help us to start thinking rationally, and provide us with insight into starting into an investigation of logic, and how to think rationally, and all these sorts of things. So, for me, it all began as I investigated the claims surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ, came to the conclusion that it was true, placed my faith in Him, and He's been helping me to start thinking rationally so that my life actually corresponds to reality. And that's both today and forevermore, because this is something that impacts the rest of my life forever.
Yep. Amen. Yeah, thank you for that. And you sure it's not virtual reality?
Well,
I saw you walking around with that Oculus.
I guess time will tell.
Okay.
Virtual time.
All right. Yeah, thank you for that. So that, officially concludes our conversation on the rules of reality. We talked a lot about the laws of logic, so I hope you enjoyed that. Now we're going to get into our Q&A portion. We do have a few questions queued up here.
Here we go.
That we'd like to get into, and they're always fun here. First one is a good one. Can y'all give an example of the law of non-contradiction? Yeah, I gave a really simplistic example about, $5 being in the wallet and not. But first of all, let's restate what the law of non-contradiction is, and perhaps give an example. So the law of non-contradiction states that A and not A cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense.
Right.
Okay? So you can't have two opposites be true at the same time and in the same sense.
Right. If I were to say that it is nighttime and daytime here in Austin, Texas,
yeah,
that's a contradiction.
Right.
If I say it's nighttime and daytime somewhere in the world, well, that's a true statement.
Yeah.
So and that's where in the same sense is so important.
Yeah.
Because if I say that it can be nighttime and daytime in the same city here on the earth, it's no, that's not true. It's either nighttime or it's daytime or it's dusk or whatever the case, right? Yeah. But you can have nighttime and daytime in two different areas of the world. So that's where the sense of it changes, and what is a contradiction in one sense all of a sudden is not a contradiction in another, right?
Yeah.
So there are things that would appear to be contradictions in the Bible, but are actually paradoxes. And this is where, you can go online and do a study or a search for, Bible contradictions, and people have created long-running lists of what they claim are Bible contradictions, right? Yeah. And this goes to show that people have a hard time identifying the law of non-contradiction, right? Yes. So they scramble the first law in failing to identify the difference between a contradiction and a paradox. Yes. So, for example, one gospel says that, King of the Jews was written on a sign above Jesus' head in Greek. One says Latin, one says Hebrew. And so they'll come along and say, oh, so the Bible's filled with contradictions. That's one of them. One sign said it was written in Greek, and the other sign it was written in Latin, and the other sign it was written in Hebrew. When a synthesis of the information would lead us to think that it's not a contradiction. A contradiction would be that the sign King of the Jews above Jesus' head was written in Greek and no other language.
Yes.
And then the other guy says it was written in Latin. Now we have a contradiction, yes. Right? But what we have is, three different testimonies with three different languages mentioned. So what that leads us to understand is that whoever made the sign wrote King of the Jews in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, or Aramaic, I'm sorry. Yeah, so it was Aramaic. So Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. So the sign had all three languages. That's just a synthesis of the information. And so it's paradoxical when we read one gospel and it just mentions one language, and another gospel mentions another language, and we go, wait a minute, how can both of these things be true? Easily. You have a sign with three different languages saying the same thing three times in three different languages. Mm-hmm. It's only a contradiction if it says the sign was written in Greek and in no other language, right? Now, if somebody introduces another language on the sign, now you've got a contradiction.
Exactly.
So same thing with, like, say, the people who argue against the Trinity, and they'll make the argument that the Trinity is a contradiction. No, a contradiction would be to say that the triune God is three gods in one God,
which is what you hear a lot of people. That's what they think we're saying,
right? Which is not the doctrine of the Trinity. No. The doctrine of the Trinity is not that we believe three gods in one God. We believe that there are three persons, or we might say personalities or personhoods. There are three persons in the one God. Mm-hmm. So you can have three persons in one God, and I think that maybe the best analogy of that.
Don't do it, Patrick.
The chicken, but the clover.
The egg. Oh.
No, I think that being that God announced that He created man in His likeness. I think that it is fair to say that we are analogous of God in the sense that we are triune beings. So we are body, soul, and spirit. Mm-hmm. And it takes all three to make us the being that we're supposed to be, right?
The being.
So if I were to say that, oh well, that's a contradiction to say that we're body, soul, and spirit, and that makes us the complete being. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not saying that there's three beings in me.
Right.
If I were to say that the body is a being, the soul is another being, and the spirit is a third being, and it takes three beings to make the one being, that would be a contradiction.
Yeah.
But we're not saying that. We're saying that there are three aspects of humanity, that a complete person is made up of body, soul, and spirit. And in that sense, I believe that God created us as triune beings because He's a triune being of another sort. He is infinitely the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, three persons in one Godhead. And so when people say that's a contradiction, it's like, no, that's a paradox. It's difficult to understand, and I don't think we'll ever fully grasp it. But it's not a contradiction.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, you just have to be just quite familiar with the law of non-contradiction, understand the full definition, and then you take a look at, okay, what is the Trinity saying? Well, they're actually two different categories. It's not just three gods, one God. It doesn't mix. It's actually three persons, one God, and then voila.
Yeah. If I say I'm a man and a woman, that's a contradiction. It's a contradiction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Make sure. All right. Good. So hopefully that gives you some good examples on the law of non-contradiction there. Second question here. Could you all expand the argument of language and how important the origins.
The origins. Orange, you glad I didn't say origin?
Yes. Let us proceed. The origins of linguistics important to creationists. So the argument of language and then how important the origins of linguistics are to, I guess, creationism, if I want to modify that a little bit. Have you thought about I personally have not done too much research on the origins of language and.
Yeah, well, so, clearly God gave Adam and Eve functioning language on day one. One of the things that I always ask people, is how old were Adam and Eve on the first day they were created? And the answer is 1 day old.
Yeah.
But they probably functioned like adults, mm-hmm. right? Probably 21, so they could drink, but...
Still wiping their bums.
But my guess is that they had a fully functioning language on day one. That they were fully functioning beings on day one of creation, right? So you even see, God communicating with Adam as far as his expectations for tending the garden and these sorts of things. So there was an obvious, clear understanding that Adam had, and then he passed his language on to his sons and so on and so forth, right? But then we see a disruption of the languages with the Tower of Babel, where God decides that mankind is too unified, that they're about to do some crazy things, and possibly Nimrod trying to invade heaven and whatnot. But at that point in time, then scattering the nations by languages. And so we do see the languages of the world being the origins of those languages there at the Tower of Babel. What language did Adam and Eve speak and pass on to their kids all the way to the Tower of Babel? I don't know.
King James English.
It probably was.
Yep.
If it was good enough for Paul. but so I don't know if I'm really answering their question.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. I don't know how this applies to creationism.
Yeah.
But
Just not sure.
But I'm guessing that this might have to do with the communication necessary for engaging in logical conversation and debate was probably instilled in Adam and Eve on day one.
Okay. Here, I just received word that it's reworded here.
We got a reworded question. Try harder.
That's not the one. I'll rephrase question. Could you expand on the argument of language and how the origins of linguistics are important to the creationist proof of God? Does that add much information?
I'm guessing.
They're assuming you understand what the argument of language.
Yeah,
means.
I haven't spent a whole lot of time studying the origins of language.
Yeah.
If I seem to remember studying something on this like years ago that you can look at the origins of language and conclude that it must have been created by a God, and we don't see language slowly evolving from grunts and
Whatever various sounds,
barks and stuff, developing or slowly evolving into a language. But if I remember it correctly, I'm guessing that what this questioner is getting at is that language itself seems to have just appeared on the scene, which goes back to Adam and Eve, being fully functioning, communicators on day one with a language that actually worked, rather than the stories that were told by evolutionists. Which is you have troglodytes in a cave, painting pictures of buffalo on a wall and clobbering their wife over the head and dragging him off into a cave, creating little troglodyte babies.
Oh, you read the same book?
Yeah. So, there's no reason to believe in any of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yes.
Linguistically speaking.
Yeah, linguistically.
So if the question, if I'm still off with what the questioner is getting at, feel free to
please
send us more. But
I'm sure we'll get plenty of complaints.
Direct your complaints to Reuben.
Some questions from the Peanut Gallery. Number one. Barack Obama regularly made straw man arguments about how his political opponents wanted to kill their grandmas and whatnot. Was he appropriating from the Wizard of Oz's scarecrow?
I just don't even know what to do with that. I think that question is directed to you, right?
No, I think it.
I'm going to say I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. It could be the Wizard of Oz's scarecrow or another scarecrow. In the line of famous scarecrows, I'm just not sure. I'd have to.
Well, you do have Batman Begins.
Yes.
No.
I would lean more towards that one than the Wizard of Oz, as he was very fearful. Right? That was the fearful guy, or he was the one without a brain. I don't know anymore. Number two, experts agree that you're wrong. How can you argue with that? And even if you think you can, you're still wrong because the experts agree you are. Has he committed a fallacy, or is he airtight logic here?
Yeah, well, that's clearly an appeal to authority.
Yes.
To which I would just say I have experts that actually agree with me. So
nice.
Yeah.
I can rain down experts on your experts, but this is not my kingdom. If Yasser Arafat weighed the same as a duck, was he made of wood?
Come on.
And logically.
Well, of course.
Yeah. I mean, goes without saying.
Yes.
Duh. One last question I think we can end on, one that I've seen creep up, especially, within the last probably generation is, we've made advances in our understanding of quantum physics. And how supposedly, and this I think just goes back to how I think a lot of modern day scientists who used to be called natural philosophers are now just bad philosophers. And what they try to do now with quantum physics is try to convince us that now the laws of logic laws of logic probably don't apply in the quantum realm, right? Once you get down to a certain particle size, things just start behaving weirdly, and things start popping in and out of existence, and now our basic principles of causality and sufficient reason now kind of go out the window, and therefore we can't even just trust what our macro world is telling us, what our experiences are telling us on this scale. So does quantum physics kind of, our gained understanding of quantum physics, throw laws of logic out the window?
And what's quantum physics?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, don't we have to identify it?
Yes, we do have to identify it. Yes.
Do we have to identify what we're observing?
Some would say in the scientific method, yes.
And aren't we assuming that those conclusions won't contradict?
I mean, you would hope so.
I mean, so yeah, when we observe things that have strange behaviors, like, just all the examples that come to mind, I shan't not say.
Sure.
But yeah, so I mean, we oftentimes see strange behaviors in things that we come into contact with, and yet we're identifying that as a strange behavior. That's not what we were expecting to find.
Yeah.
Right. So even in that process of identifying and assuming that our discovery is not contradicting something else, or that we're not we don't find ourselves on the horns of a false dichotomy and these sorts of things. Right. So even at that level, that I'm not even going to pretend I understand, we have to assume that when I put the cat in the box, that I can identify properly the cat and the box, whether the cat is actually there or not.
Yeah, very good.
Does that help?
Yeah, so you kind of just take a step back and say, I'm still using the laws of logic.
Still.
Right, you can't deny them. This is what we've been trying to.
In order to engage in science,
yeah,
you have to use the laws of logic.
Exactly.
Even if what you observe is very strange.
And and where I've seen a big push with quantum physics, especially when they start noticing these strange behavior, things popping in and out of existence, apparently, what they try to extrapolate from that then is, well, it's possible then our universe that once started off as some sort of vibration of strings in some dimension could have then brought about randomly a universe, just kind of popped into existence from nothing, which is actually a quantum realm of strings and whatnot.
Right.
But this is where the big push is, basically trying to remove the need for a necessary being.
Right.
So the universe is infinite, so to speak, so therefore you don't need God.
Yeah, but they've only pushed the problem back. They haven't actually solved it.
Yeah.
Because they haven't solved biogenesis, they haven't solved, the initial cause, so
or the fine tuning of that.
Sure. I mean, you could go on and on with the fact that there still has to be an uncaused cause.
Yeah.
We know that we don't exist in an infinite universe. Therefore, there must be an infinite cause that caused it all.
Yes.
Can't avoid it.
Yeah.
And as much as they're trying to get behind, the finite nature of our universe, they'll continue to press and dig and research. And I'm all for it. Go for it. It's just eventually you're going to have to come to the conclusion that God did it.
Yes. But the laws of logic will always hold.
Yep.
To deny it is to affirm it.
Yeah, the minute you deny the laws of logic, you're using the laws of logic to deny the laws of logic.
So
thereby proving the laws of logic.
Think on that one and see how much sleep you get tonight. Well, thank you, audience, for joining us and sticking with us all this time and learning about the laws of logic, the rules of reality. We hope you enjoyed it. And again, we encourage you to check out our past episodes on our Studio 118 YouTube channel. And again, share this link, like, subscribe, and share on your social media platforms and get other people involved in the conversation. But we hope that you think hard and think critically from this point on, especially as you're reading through the scriptures and see how they apply. Again, we thank you. I'm Reuben. This is Bunjee. We'll see you next month or 2 weeks from now. I don't know.
Who can say?
Yeah, who can say? See you next time.